The empire was vast, stretching across lands where the sun seldom set, and its reach was unrivaled. For centuries, it had been a beacon of power, stability, and wealth. But beneath this facade of unyielding dominance, tensions were beginning to stir. Rivalries both within and outside its borders threatened the very foundation of the empire. The ruler, a leader once hailed as a genius of statecraft, now found himself ensnared in a web of political intrigue. His empire, built through generations of triumph, was on the brink of unraveling. In the heart of the imperial court, whispers began to spread, rumors of discontent, murmurs of conspiracy, and the shifting allegiances of the emperor's closest advisors. This wasn't just a struggle for power, it was a battle for survival. The emperor had long been a master of diplomacy, but diplomacy alone would not save him this time. The political landscape was changing, and those who had once been loyal were now considering a future without him. Among these ambitious figures stood a young general, once a trusted ally of the emperor but now disillusioned by years of service and seeing the flaws in the empire's leadership. This general, whose name would soon be etched in the annals of history, had dreams of his own. He had built his reputation on the battlefield, leading successful campaigns and winning the loyalty of his soldiers. His ambition was undeniable, and as the empire's power began to fade, so too did his allegiance to the emperor. To him, it was no longer about loyalty, it was about seizing an opportunity, about taking control before the empire collapsed from within. But the emperor was not blind to the shifting winds of power. He had his own network of loyalists, his spies, and his allies, and he knew the stakes of the coming conflict. Yet this was no ordinary power struggle. It was a contest for the soul of the empire. Both men, the emperor and the general, believed they were the rightful rulers. For one, it was a matter of duty and tradition. For the other, it was about seizing a throne that had been promised but never given. Their clash was not just a military one. It was a collision of ideologies, of two men who saw the empire's future in starkly different ways. The general's supporters, men and women who had rallied around his vision for a new order, believed in the promise of reform, in a new empire that could reclaim its former glory through strength and decisive leadership. They had grown weary of the emperor's indecisiveness, his hesitation in making bold moves, his increasing reliance on advisors who were seen as weak or corrupt. To them, the general's rise was not merely a personal ambition, it was the chance to restore the empire to its rightful place in the world. The emperor, on the other hand, clung to the old ways. He believed that stability could only be maintained by preserving the status quo, by relying on the loyalty of his people and the strength of his alliances. He surrounded himself with advisors who reinforced his beliefs and assured him that his empire was not doomed, that the general's growing power could be neutralized through careful maneuvering. But even as he convinced himself of this, deep down, he knew that a storm was brewing. The once unshakable foundation of the empire was beginning to crumble, and the emperor was too late to act decisively. His hesitation would soon prove to be his greatest downfall. The young general, sensing his moment of opportunity, made a bold move. He began to gather his forces. The emperor, now fully aware of the threat, began to tighten his grip on the court. But power struggles were not the only threat facing the empire. Across its borders, foreign enemies watched with keen interest. Rivals saw the weakening of the empire as a chance to strike, to capitalize on the chaos within the empire's borders. Their spies infiltrated the empire's defenses, and their armies massed along the frontiers. To the outside world, the empire appeared to be on the brink of collapse, and they would soon learn that a single day could alter the course of history. As tensions escalated, both sides prepared for an inevitable confrontation. The general's forces, though smaller, were united by a sense of purpose and shared ambition. His soldiers trusted him. They had fought alongside him in previous campaigns and believed that he would lead them to victory. His army was disciplined, battle-hardened, and eager for a decisive confrontation that would shape the future of the empire. On the other side, the emperor's forces were loyal but divided. The emperor's inability to act swiftly had allowed factions to form within his ranks. There were those who were still faithful to him, but their loyalty was waning, and whispers of betrayal were growing louder by the day. In the days leading up to the confrontation, there were moments of tension and uncertainty. The imperial court was in disarray, with advisors scrambling to solidify their positions. The general's supporters, emboldened by their leader's confidence, moved in the shadows, ready to strike when the time was right. But the emperor, ever the strategist, was not without his own plans. He knew that a direct confrontation with the general's forces would be a dangerous gamble, but he also knew that the very survival of his empire depended on it. The atmosphere in the empire was one of dread and anticipation. People in the streets spoke of the coming war, not knowing who would emerge victorious or what the consequences of the battle would be. The common folk, caught in the midst of the impending conflict, could only hope that the empire would not tear itself apart. But for those in power, the stakes were much higher. For the emperor, it was a matter of legacy. Would his reign be remembered as one that held the empire together, or would he go down in history as the ruler who failed to protect it? For the general, it was about more than just the throne. It was about reshaping the very fabric of the empire to create something new from the ashes of the old. As the day of reckoning drew near, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of history. The empire stood at a precipice, and the choices made in the coming hours would have repercussions for generations to come. Each side believed it was on the verge of victory, but neither could have foreseen the ultimate cost of the conflict. The empire would never be the same again. One day, one battle would forever alter its fate. The tension had reached a boiling point. For weeks, the empire had teetered on the edge of chaos, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. In the early hours of the fateful day, a palpable sense of urgency filled the air. Both sides knew that this would be the day that would determine the future of the empire. The general, with his forces arrayed in readiness, had made his move. He had carefully calculated every step, choosing the time and place for the clash. The emperor, meanwhile, had prepared his forces to respond, but he was not the decisive figure he once had been. The emperor's court was filled with nervous anticipation, but the emperor himself was strangely calm, perhaps too calm, as if he were trying to convince himself that all was not lost. As dawn broke over the empire's vast landscape, the first signs of movement came from the general's army. His troops, trained in the art of war, were already on the march, their steps synchronized with precision, each soldier focused on the task ahead. They had come to this moment prepared, knowing that this would be the defining battle of their lives. They were fighting not just for their leader, but for the future they believed in, a future where the old ways would be swept away, and a new order would rise from the ashes. The general's forces had been carefully chosen, each unit selected for its skills and loyalty. His soldiers were veterans, men who had seen countless battles and knew the harsh realities of war. They were fiercely loyal to him, not out of duty to the empire, but because of their unwavering belief in his vision. The general had built his reputation on his ability to lead them to victory, and now they would follow him to the very gates of the emperor's stronghold. The air was thick with anticipation, and every footstep seemed to echo across the land as the general's army advanced. Meanwhile, the emperor's forces were still gathering, though not with the same urgency. His army was large, but it was divided. The emperor's once loyal generals were now filled with doubt, unsure whether to stand behind their leader or seek to preserve their own interests. The soldiers who made up the emperor's forces were disciplined, but many were disillusioned. They had served the emperor faithfully for years, but they now saw the cracks in his reign. They wondered if they could still win this battle or if the empire's time had already passed. The emperor's court had been rife with whispers of betrayal, and some of those whispers had found their way to the battlefield. As the emperor's forces mobilized, there was no certainty about how unified they truly were. The general, aware of the disarray within the emperor's ranks, pressed on with his plan. His strategy was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and shatter the emperor's resolve before he could rally his forces. The general's troops, experienced and battle-hardened, moved quickly. They knew the terrain well, having fought across the empire for years, and now they used that knowledge to their advantage. As the two armies drew closer, the anticipation grew. The earth seemed to tremble under the weight of the approaching battle. The emperor, now aware of the general's advance, had little time to act. His advisors urged him to move swiftly, but there was hesitation in the emperor's decisions. He was not the man he once was. His indecision had led to this moment, and now the weight of the empire's future rested on his shoulders. The once great emperor, who had held the world in his grasp, found himself facing the reality of his own fragility. As the general's army neared, the emperor's forces began to form lines of defense, but they lacked the cohesion that had once made them an unstoppable force. The emperor's soldiers stood their ground, but there was a sense of uncertainty in the air, as if the battle was already lost before it had even begun. The general's first strike came with the force of a thunderstorm. His cavalry, moving swiftly and silently through the early morning mist, descended upon the emperor's left flank. The emperor's soldiers, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the attack, faltered. The general's troops struck with precision, using their mobility to create chaos in the emperor's lines. The emperor's forces, although large, were scattered and disorganized. The general's soldiers, with their unity and focus, were proving to be more than a match for them. But the battle was far from over. As the general's forces advanced, the emperor's remaining loyalists began to rally. They formed defensive positions, hoping to slow the general's momentum. The emperor, in a last-ditch effort, ordered his reserves to counterattack. It was a desperate move, but it showed that he was not yet willing to surrender. His forces fought fiercely, but the general's soldiers were relentless. The general had anticipated this move, and he had prepared his own reserves to counter any counterattack. It was a battle of attrition, each side pushing forward, hoping to break the other. As the hours passed, the battle reached a fever pitch. The clash of steel and the cries of soldiers filled the air. The emperor's forces, though they fought with courage, were beginning to waver. The general's troops, fueled by their belief in their leader's vision, pressed on without mercy. They knew that the fate of the empire rested on this day, and they could not afford to lose. The emperor's forces, despite their numbers, were losing ground. The general's soldiers, relentless and unified, continued to push forward, shattering any hopes the emperor had of a successful defense. The emperor, realizing that his position was becoming untenable, ordered his remaining reserves to retreat. But it was too late. The general had already anticipated this move and had positioned his forces to intercept any retreating units. The battle was turning in the general's favor, and the emperor's once formidable army was now in full retreat. The emperor's soldiers, beaten and broken, fled the battlefield, leaving their leader vulnerable. The general's forces had won the day, but the cost was far from clear. The empire would be forever changed by this one day, and the emperor's reign would soon come to an end. As the dust settled on the battlefield, the general's victory seemed certain. His soldiers stood victorious, though they were not without casualties. The cost of war had been high, but their mission was accomplished. The empire's fate had been sealed, and the general's vision for the future was now within his grasp. But even in victory, the general knew that the battle for the empire was far from over. There would be many more challenges ahead, but for now, the first phase of his plan had been completed. The emperor's empire had fallen, and the general's rise to power had begun. The battlefield was a scene of chaos and confusion. Smoke rose in thick, choking plumes from the remnants of the skirmishes, filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt powder and flesh. The ground beneath was slick with mud and blood, each step a reminder of the high price that had already been paid. In the midst of this carnage, the fight was far from over. What had begun as a series of scattered engagements was now evolving into something much larger. The initial chaos had subsided, but the real struggle was just beginning. The general, ever the strategist, had seen the battlefield through a different lens. He was not just reacting to what was happening, he was controlling the flow of the conflict, manipulating it to fit his vision. His forces had already made significant advances, breaking through several defensive lines and pushing the emperor's soldiers back. But the emperor was not the kind of man to surrender easily. Despite the disarray in his ranks, he had begun to regroup, consolidating what remained of his forces and preparing for a final stand. The emperor's loyalists, though fewer in number, were not without fight. They held strategic positions on the field, using the terrain to their advantage. They had once been the backbone of the emperor's power, and now they were determined to make their last stand a worthy one. Their formations were tight, their resolve firm. But it was clear that they were fighting not for the emperor's legacy, but for their own survival. Each soldier in the emperor's ranks knew that if they lost this battle, there would be no second chance. The empire would crumble, and they would be swept away with it. The general, ever watchful, noticed the shift in the emperor's forces. He saw the way they had begun to rally around their leaders, the glint of determination in their eyes. The battle had reached a crucial point, where every move could tip the balance. He understood that victory was not yet assured. His forces had gained ground, but the emperor's troops were not yet beaten. The general knew that it was in these moments, when the battle was at its most intense, that the true nature of a commander revealed itself. It was not enough to simply win the engagement. The general had to break the emperor's will to fight. As his soldiers pressed forward, the general began to adjust his tactics. He had learned the layout of the battlefield, understood the strengths and weaknesses of his opponent, and now he used this knowledge to his advantage. The emperor's forces, despite their numbers, were not as nimble. They were weighed down by the traditional, rigid formations that had served them in the past but were now becoming liabilities in the face of the general's more flexible, adaptive strategy. The general's cavalry, quick and relentless, circled the emperor's defenses, drawing the soldiers into an encirclement. At the same time, his infantry moved swiftly through the broken terrain, using the uneven ground to their advantage as they outflanked the emperor's lines. The general's ability to read the battlefield was unmatched. Where the emperor saw a line of defense, the general saw opportunities for attack. Where the emperor's forces stood firm, the general saw weaknesses that could be exploited. His troops, hardened by years of campaign, followed his lead without hesitation. They were not just soldiers, they were instruments of his vision. Every order, every maneuver, was executed with a precision that only the most battle-hardened troops could achieve. But even with all this skill and preparation, the general knew that the battle was still far from won. On the other side of the battlefield, the emperor was struggling to maintain control. The initial shock of the general's assault had thrown his forces into disarray, but now, as the dust began to settle, he tried to rally his commanders. There were still pockets of resistance, areas where his men had held their ground and managed to inflict damage on the general's forces. But the emperor's men were not as united as they once had been. Distrust had crept in, and the soldiers' loyalty was now in question. Some were unsure whether their commander could lead them to victory. Others were already thinking of surrender, of escaping the battlefield alive. The emperor himself, once a symbol of authority and control, was now a man caught between hope and despair. His mind raced as he considered his next move. He had seen his forces falter under the general's relentless pressure, and with each failed counterattack, the realization began to set in: this battle might be lost. But he couldn't bring himself to give the order to retreat. To do so would be to acknowledge his defeat, to acknowledge that the empire he had spent a lifetime building was crumbling before his eyes. Instead, he pushed his soldiers forward, willing them to fight for a cause that was slipping further from his grasp with each passing moment. As the hours wore on, the struggle intensified. The general's forces, growing more confident with every passing minute, began to press the emperor's army into smaller and smaller sections of the battlefield. The emperor's soldiers, their formations broken, found themselves fighting in disjointed skirmishes rather than a unified front. The general's cavalry, fast and deadly, harassed the emperor's flanks, preventing any attempts at regrouping. The general's infantry, relentless and methodical, forced the emperor's men into a retreat, each step back taking them further from the stronghold they had hoped to protect. For the emperor's loyalists, the realization of defeat was a bitter pill to swallow. They fought on, but it was no longer for victory, it was for survival. The emperor's elite guard, the last bastion of his power, fought fiercely in a desperate attempt to hold the line. But even they, trained in the art of war and dedicated to their emperor, were feeling the weight of the battle. They knew that time was running out. The general's forces were overwhelming them, and soon they would have nowhere left to retreat. The emotional stakes were higher than ever. For the emperor's soldiers, the battlefield had become a place where loyalty and fear collided. Those who had followed their leader for years now had to question whether their faith in him had been misplaced. For the general's soldiers, the victory they sought was not just about conquest, It was about the future they had imagined, a future where the empire would be remade in their image. Each clash of weapons, each strike delivered, was a step closer to that new world. A world where the general would sit on the throne, not the emperor. As the day wore on, the general's forces began to encircle the emperor's army completely.